scaling technologies. So one of the things that we first need to do before we get to the disparate scaling technologies is to realize what a bridge is, because all of the scaling technologies need bridges. And we also have to appreciate the danger of bridging. So scaling solutions require bridging or trust, but it has many challenges. And we can see these challenges not even having to look at it on a technical level. We can see it just by the amount of money that's been stolen in bridges in the last year. I think at the peak, there was about $14 billion in total locked value in bridges. And last year alone, over $2 billion was stolen. And part of that problem, obviously, is mistakes with teams or contract code. And some of those problems can be addressed, but some of the problems are more intrinsic to the construction of a bridge itself, and we have to consider these intrinsic security vulnerabilities when considering and designing scaling solutions. So what exactly is a bridge, and how do they interact with scaling solutions? Bridges effectively allow an asset to be locked in one context and then used in another. There's no way that I can actually send Ethereum out of Ethereum into optimism. I am locking Ethereum in optimism, and then in Ethereum, and then I'm using it in optimism. And I have a large number of risks that will exist, which I will discuss, while I'm in that locked context. And to start understanding the risks, we need to first look at the trade-offs in the different scaling solutions. So what are the current scaling solutions and proposals for scaling solutions? So if we go back in time with Ethereum, one of the earliest scaling solutions was state channels. And examples of state channels are Raiden and Lightning. Then Plasma was proposed. That hasn't really gone anywhere, but we should at least consider Plasma when we're looking at the trade-offs in technology of different scaling mechanisms. Sidechains are scaling mechanisms, so having something like BNB or Polygon are technically a scaling mechanism for Ethereum, and we've seen a lot of that being used as scaling mechanisms with the popularity of moving contract and EVM execution into an alternate environment. Rollups obviously are a scaling mechanism, like optimism and loop ring, and most recently Validity has been another sort of proposal with scaling, and Starkware has sort of an offering there. The problem that we get to that all of these scaling solutions have, or the challenges that they face, they have challenges with synchronization, they have challenges with validity, and then they have challenges with data sharing. And the different solutions have different degree of challenge in each one of those areas. It's high altitude up here. There's a little bit of dry mouth. So if we look at the scaling solution trade-offs, we can actually consider the scaling solutions and the trade-offs within that set of scaling solutions that I've covered really along two axes. One axis being the level of validation that is taking place, and the other axis being the level of data availability that's being provided by the scaling solution. And we can see, if we look at something like ZK rollups, we have high data availability and a high degree of validity guarantees. If we look at something like optimism, we still have high data availability, but we have less rigorous validity guarantees. And then you can see Plasma has really neither, and Validity, Validium has low data availability but high validity. So as we've covered kind of what the scaling solutions are generally and what the trade-offs of each one are, we need to start looking at the risks. So one risk that we've obviously seen exploited in the ecosystem with hacks in the last year is contract risk. So when I go from one state, say the Ethereum base chain, into another state, say BNB, I am suffering contract risk in both the exit contract at the Ethereum side, and I'm also suffering contract risk on the BNB side. Now, the cool part about that is that we can actually solve that contract risk through formal verification. So there's no reason that I can't drive that risk to zero. We also suffer from VM risk. So if there's a bug, say, in Ethereum, or there's a bug in the ZK snark that's used in a ZK rollup, or there's a bug in BNB chain, I suffer when I'm in a scaling context from the risk of that VM. And again, that's one of these easier things to solve because I can use formal verification, I can use code audits to minimize my risk in both contexts. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So when we look at validation, one of the requirements of going from one context to another is that you need a mechanism of validation of the state transitions that happened in one context back into the base chain or vice versa. And unfortunately, for some of the solutions like sidechain or Plasma, it isn't easy or potentially possible to provide proofs, and that's one of the great advantages of things like rollups and Validium, is because I have these ZK mechanisms of proving, I can prove those things to be correct without having to have a trusted entity or some set of exterior off-chain consensus rules to know that I have validity in the scaling context. We also have an Oracle problem specific to sidechains and Plasma. So one of the problems, if we look at the sidechain, we look at Ethereum and we look at BNB, how does BNB know anything about Ethereum? And how does Ethereum know anything about BNB? They're completely independent systems that have different consensus mechanisms that are progressing asynchronously. So somebody has to tell me what the state of each thing is, not only what the tip is, what the highest head is, but also what the actual, say, commitment to the state root is. So to cross into sidechain or Plasma, I am necessarily going to need an oracleized validator set of some form. That could be a single point oracle, that could be a many point oracle. But what I've done here is I've created an off-chain consensus mechanism that has some set of incentives that is completely independent and different than Ethereum. So I have to understand the risk that I've just created in doing that and the security of that secondary mechanism. So in some of these, sidechains doesn't require watching, it only requires oracleization, but state channels, Plasma, and rollups all require some form of watching. So if you are indeed in one of these scaling contexts, you have to continuously monitor that scaling context to make sure that it is valid relative to the things that you care about. Now, you could do that yourself, so you don't need a trusted entity, but functionally speaking, most people want to delegate that to somebody else. So that means that they're going to, again, create new incentives, new consensus mechanisms, and new processes that are going to live off-chain, and you must recognize what those are and what impacts that has on your security. We have an ordering problem. So we don't have any ordering guarantees when we're running in an off-chain context. We can create mechanisms for ordering, but what am I now doing? I'm recreating the blockchain with a secondary consensus mechanism, a secondary set of rules, and a secondary set of incentives. And then we have a data availability problem, right? So when we make a commitment back to the base layer, if I ever make a commitment that becomes canonicalized and I don't have data availability that went under that commitment, I could essentially lose state and lose my ability to further interact with that off-chain context. And then there's also the issue of synchrony. The synchrony issue is most easily understood when we consider two chains. So if I think about BNB and I think about Ethereum, there's a problem in BNB, and BNB has a rollback, but we already made a commitment on a BNB to Ethereum bridge back to Ethereum. I've potentially released assets back to Ethereum that were in BNB. If I roll that back, those assets are now gone. So I have synchronization risk between the two chains that are running asynchronously, and the only solution I have here is to wait. But if we understand how chains progress, regardless of the consensus mechanism being proof of stake or proof of work, they never actually ensure finalization. They only logarithmically approach one in the assurance of finalization. So technically, you have to wait an infinite period of time to cross contexts. And so the last one here is proving availability, and most people don't realize that this exists. But let's take optimism, for example. if I assume that optimism has state which has similar complexity to Ethereum represented in optimism, let's say I have a systemic failure in trust in that system, and everybody needs to create fraud proofs to exit that system. And I have many, many fraud proofs. I have a 2-week period to validate those fraud proofs on Ethereum while I'm still competing with every other system that's using Ethereum to run transactions. So how many of those fraud proofs can clear within the challenge window? So I don't actually have a guarantee that I can ever redeem the receipt that is my guarantee of validity, which is the fraud proof. So what does this all mean? We are introducing trusted entities, and we are carrying perpetual off-chain risks whenever we use one of these scaling technologies, and we have to always be aware of what these risks are and mitigate them appropriately. There is one proposal that you could have for a solution, and that is reciprocal validation. So if I took 2 arbitrary chains, like the Ethereum base layer and any of these scaling solutions, a sidechain, rollup plasmas, etc., if I have a periodic link, which they already have, but during that periodic link, I also ensure reciprocal validation, I can actually solve almost all of the problems that exist with every one of the scaling solutions through reciprocal validation. So what do I mean by that? I mean that in this case, let's just take Ethereum and optimism. If I made it so that if optimism ever made a bad commitment to Ethereum, that Ethereum block was also invalid based off that bad commitment, and that block got rolled back, I could now solve almost every single one of the problems that currently exists. So that's reciprocal validation. You're guaranteeing synchronicity, and you're guaranteeing rolling forward and rolling backwards together with the solutions. So basically what happens if we talk about reciprocal validation, I can eliminate the last half of all of those problems, and the only ones that I'm left with are contract risk and VM risk, which I can solve through formal verification. Unfortunately, reciprocal validation requires a change to the base layer, and it also requires an ordination of what the scaling solution is. So one proposal is that you change the base layer, and that's effectively what Qui Network is trying to do. So you can think of Qui Network as a scaling solution where we have chains that are outside in different contexts, but we enforce reciprocal validation periodically and asynchronously. And what that ultimately does for us is it gives us guarantees of atomic roll forward, atomic roll backward. It gives us guarantees of finalization in-chain context, which is exactly one after one block. And it also allows us to scale. So we don't get any of the sacrifices of the other scaling solutions because we introduce reciprocal validation. So what exactly is Qui Network? Qui Network is a hierarchy of merge mine blockchains. So if you want to think of that prime blockchain as your base layer, we then have subordinate chains which run independently and asynchronously, but periodically get referenced back into the base chain through the process of merge mining. What merge mining does here is it creates a hash link which is valid in multiple contexts. Once that reference is available, I can use that reference to do a proof to all data transitions that happened prior to that reference. So I don't need an oracle. I don't need to wait, because if that block which created that reference rolls back, it's going to roll back in all state in which that block is valid. So there's no synchronization problem. There's no oracleization problem. And there's really no data availability problem, because each one of the subchains has the same set of incentives to carry on data availability in their context. And so what does this actually allow us to do? It allows us to create performance subnets. This uses a variation of Nakamoto consensus, and this can dynamically and horizontally scale with demand. So there's no limitation to this ontology or this structure. This is just an arbitrary starting point. But if the chain algorithmically decides that throughput is being reached, it can add more chains horizontally. And the only long-term trade-off that I get is delay in global settlement. So in one of the subordinate chains, I can operate on 10-second blocks. And if I'm only operating in a single context, I will get performance just like I would see in Ethereum. However, let's say I want to go from one of these blocks to one of the far blocks. The sacrifice here is that as that width and the number of chains increases, the time to settlement over that ontology will increase. So that's the trade-off. We've broken consistency with global consensus, which allows us to push throughput. So this is an example of what it looks like to do an eventual reference. So say I have this block, and I'm looking at this context. If I start mining blocks, I'll eventually create what I call a coincident block, which is creating a hash-linked reference between the different contexts. So now all contexts that are just highlighted are now referenceable in that subordinate Cypress 2 context. And if I keep progressing, what we'll see is that I'll eventually start highlighting the entirety of the ontology. So you can see there was a time delay between a transaction happening in Paxos 2 and being re-referenceable in Cypress 2, but we've asynchronously guaranteed eventual referencing. So what do we call this? We call this proof of work 2.0. So the idea here is that we can get layer 2 speed with layer 1 security, and we can also ensure reliability. Because this is based off a truly distributed work-based mechanism, we can transact without downtime. We're secure because we are technically bridging, but if you understand the risks associated with bridging, we've effectively eliminated all of them. And then we're also scalable. So, right, our goal is that we can do 50,000 plus transactions per second, and as demand keeps on increasing, we can dynamically increase the number of shards, which will keep increasing demand, or throughput. Okay, so I got 57 seconds for questions. If there are any builders that want to work on Qui or have applications that they want to deploy on Qui, come talk to myself or Raleigh when I'm done. But if anyone wants a question, we're open for it. Go ahead. Oh, no. Okay, well, cool, guys. I appreciate you listening, and I hope everyone has a good time at ETHDenver.